ये लाइट जलाना जरा।
Good evening to one and all present here. Welcome to Rendezvous, the country's biggest virtual conclave. Well, it's the 5th day of the series, and with each day, it's getting bigger and better. It's not just one of those evenings when you're constantly on your phone doing nothing productive. It's the most awaited night of the series. Yes, my friends, you heard it right. We have with us today the presence of an eminent personality. He is the Member of Parliament, India's Sherpa to the G7 and G20. He is the former Minister of Railways, Minister of Commerce and Industry, and Civil Aviation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Mr. Suresh Prabhu. Good evening, sir. How are you? Now, I would request our Principal, Sir Dr. S.P. Agrawal, to welcome our guests and share a few words of wisdom.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to our dignitary, Honorable Mr. Suresh Prabhuji, my colleague, dear young friends. Actually, we are really honored and it's our privilege to welcome Mr. Suresh Prabhu, MP, Rajya Sabha and ex-cabinet minister, who has a lot of experience, knowledge and market knowledge, or I should say, because I believe he is a professional chartered accountant also. So, sir, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we welcome you on behalf of Ramanujan College, which is a Delhi University maintained institution. We have about 3,000 students and about 200 faculty and non-teaching staff. Sir, our focus in our college is mainly mathematical sciences, commerce management, and social science and humanities. And besides into teaching of undergraduate honors courses, ours is a teachers training center from Ministry of Education under the flagship scheme of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya National Mission for Teachers and Teaching. And we have already trained during this COVID about 60,000 teachers on ICT MOOCs and how to conduct online classes. So with this background, sir, once again, I welcome you, and I'm sure your experience sharing with these young kids will help them to lead in the market. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would request you to address the audience. The floor is yours, sir.
Should I speak?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please
Okay. So thank you, sir, Professor sir, for inviting me. Thank my young friends for being here. And thank you all for organizing this very exciting event. And that too, which is such a prestigious institution like yours, who has been doing this commendable work in teacher education that just you mentioned, which incidentally is going to be a major thrust of the new education policy. Only the few days ago, I had a very interesting conversation with the education minister, who is my dear friend and colleague. And I also have another role. I'm the chancellor, the founding chancellor of a new university called Rishihud University. So we are having a conversation, and then I had asked him this question about how do you get teachers that you share in the society. When we expect teachers to train and create a new generation of young leaders for the country and for the world, how do you ensure that the teacher themselves will occupy a prominent place in the society? And that's how we're discussing, and I'm very happy that you are actually doing the teacher education. Also, I'm very happy to know that the mathematics is one of your major issue. Also, liberal arts, that's very important because that's how the imagination of people will be fired. And then they will become, over a period of time, whatever they would like to be. But initially, their own latent talent will come to fore through such liberal arts. And therefore, I'm very happy that you're doing that. And thank you very much for doing this. As you asked me to speak on very important issue, my young friends have asked me to do that. Aviation. I was also the Minister of Aviation under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In fact, this is the 10th cabinet position I held in the last 25 years. So this is the last one I had held. So this is an important position for me. Aviation is a many ways important for India. One, it creates connectivity. And as has been seen globally, that connectivity itself can add to few points to GDP. All kinds of connectivity, whether it's by road, by ports, by railways, by air connectivity, can add to it. Now, there's a new dimension to connectivity also, which of course we'll not discuss today. And that's digital connectivity. The new world that we are all entering and have to embrace, that's a digital world. So that connectivity will be even more important. But connectivity is going to be the key to economic progress. So one part of aviation is connectivity. That helps in many ways. If we have connectivity, why it adds to GDP. People in the remotest part of the world, of the country, in our case, will get connected to the market. Social benefits, they can get medical treatment, they can fly and get a medical treatment in the best of the places. Students can go to the education institution, like for example, your prestigious institution. Even the farthest part of the country can come there and study. And of course, the social interactions will lead to better integration in the society. So that's all benefits. But more importantly, economically, when you have connectivity, why it adds to GDP? The integration of markets in itself makes economic growth. What do you think is the reason why the countries in the Europe, which fought bitter wars for decades, for centuries actually? In fact, you cannot write world history without wars. And one of the worst wars were also fought in Europe. And the Europeans fought wars in other geographies to capture territories, to protect territories. Even in Latin America, That time, of course, it was not Latin America, it was Southern America. Became Latin America because of wars between Spaniards and Portuguese. In fact, the Pope had to divide into two parts because both were Catholics believing in the Roman Catholic Church. They fought war in Asia. Even in India, there was a Portuguese colony, there was a Dutch colony, there was a French colony also, in some smaller part. So wars were fought by Europeans, but then they came together and formed European Union. What is the reason? That integration of market, one unified market, will add to GDP's growth, which has been proved. So connectivity creates integration, integration adds to GDP. So therefore, when I was a Minister of Aviation, I came out with India's first ever air cargo policy, allowing India's marketable produce to go to the Indian market in different parts of the country as well as globally. That includes parallelly, as I was also holding the parallel charge of Commerce Industry Minister, I came out with agriculture export policy, targeting $100 billion of agriculture exports over the next few years' time. But that agriculture export is not possible without connectivity. And some part of connectivity has to be air, because some of the agriculture produce has to reach the market as soon as possible when it is harvested. Floriculture, flowers. Just imagine, there's a market in Netherlands called Aalsmeer, which is probably, at that time, of course, was one of the largest market in the world, flower market. Floriculture was promoted because of that. Of course, now there are so many other markets that come out, including Dubai. But flowers produced in Northeast can reach Delhi in few hours' time. How much the floriculturist will earn money? The fruits that we produce in India, and we now produce, really speaking, all kinds of fruit. Even kiwis, which once upon a time were seen to be the national fruit of New Zealand. And there's even the cricket team is known as kiwis. Now produced in India. Lychees, of course, have been produced in Muzaffarpur, in Bihar, for the best ones. Apples in Himachal. But all of that can go to different locations in India and then globally. Just imagine the benefit that will happen to the economy. Fish. I don't eat fish, though I am elected. I was 4-time Lok Sabha MP from Konkan, the west coast of India, but I don't eat fish. So I represented the fish-eating population without eating fish. Imagine the money that the fishermen can get, but all of that needs connectivity. So one of the benefit of aviation is connectivity. Second, jobs creation. Aviation had added few million jobs. And thanks to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's policy of connecting remotest of the areas through UDAN program, which took us to one of the fastest growing aviation market in the world, make it grow to the third largest aviation market in the world, created a lot of jobs. Dubai is always touted as a success story. Dubai's success lies because of airport, aviation. Several lakhs of people are brought to Dubai as a transit passengers or as their final destination. And they come and spend money in Dubai. And then to attract more, they have created more attractions in Dubai. And that's what I was mentioning about even the market of flowers. So they are creating markets for different kinds. So business travelers also will come there. But all of that, the creation of market in Dubai, the tourism that happened in Dubai all happened because of aviation. So aviation creates jobs. And that's why it is very important for us. To do that, we organized, to get all the global players come to India and participate. We organized in India on 15th and 16th of January 2019, year and a half ago, world's first global aviation summit, in which we invited all the stakeholders in aviation. Because when you fly the plane, you can feel that you can fly the plane only because of people in the cockpit. They can make it fly. But just imagine the amount of effort that goes into a plane flying. Literally few hundred people work behind the scene to make it happen. It's like a drama on the stage. When you watch, you can see only few actors there. But so many backstage activity goes on for them to act. That so you can applaud and enjoy the play. So we organized this Global Aviation Summit, bringing all global players together, in which we unveiled a program. How can you manufacture aircraft in India? If we are going to need, as per the Boeing's own estimate, 2,300 aircraft in the next few years' time, India alone is going to need for their own use. And that's mainly passengers. Now, when I unveiled in the same aviation summit, cargo policy, you can imagine how many more aircrafts will be needed, because cargo again will need aircrafts. So if you need so many aircraft for passengers and cargo, why not manufacture in India over a period of time? At least make a roadmap. If you do that, how much benefit small and medium enterprise in India will get? Because literally few lakh components go into making a one plane. And if those components can be manufactured by SMEs, how much benefit India's economy will get? How many more jobs will be created offsite? And therefore, we organized this Global Aviation Summit, brought together everybody. And we prepared a roadmap, including making drones in India, which will be over a period of time a $1 trillion market. And we unveiled a drone policy. Just imagine drone itself is part of aviation. Can be another big opportunity for India. And we could be early movers. We actually moved the policy. So that is the context in which the idea is that being such an important sector from economic perspective, social perspective, even political perspective, because if some areas of India remain not so well developed, you have to pay a political price for it as a country. I remember when I went to Bihar and laid foundation for airport in Darbhanga, and today that airport is operational. You cannot imagine the huge joy on the faces of people. The benefit that will accrue over a period of time to the place, which would now get more developed. So that's a benefit, social, political, economic. And therefore, aviation being so important, today we are facing a very big challenge in which aviation is grounded globally. The aviation industry, as was estimated much earlier, when beginning of the COVID, would lose maybe few $100 billion globally. That would mean that many of the airlines will wipe out their own capital. Several airlines, including Lufthansa, one of the top airlines in the world, is now asking for bailout from the government. The entire aviation industry in US is dependent on bailout from US government. So the grounding of aircrafts globally has very adversely impacted the airlines, which are more important because airlines get counted. The airports will not get money because airports get money from the charges that they receive from the airlines when they land or take off. Then so many back office which I mentioned, catering services, air catering, maintenance people, the crew, the ground staff, so many of them. Tourism, travel tourism, which is dependent on aviation completely. Hospitality industry, all of them have faced a big challenge because of Corona. This is unprecedented. And people are even saying to go to pre-COVID level, that is beginning of the year level, probably it might take several more years. So we are actually facing a problem. And to kickstart it, I think we'll have to first address the underlying cause, that is the pandemic itself. Finding solution to the health care is very important for aviation industry to take off. Some airlines have started that they do quick testing to make sure that you are eligible to fly or rather safe to fly. Of course, these are all hopeful, wishful thinking that once you have test, that means you will not be infected. But you never know what will be the cause. But this is one of the difficult phase for the aviation industry. And because of aviation, the entire downstream and upstream industry, from upstream like manufacturers and others, downstream hospitality and all ancillary sectors, tourism, travel, all of them are very badly affected. So I'm glad that you decided to focus on this sector because this is one of the high job intensive sector. And therefore, we have to revive it globally. The IATA, which is one of the top tourism industry organization, is also trying to find a solution. But till we are able to address the main issue of pandemic, we'll not be able to get it back on the normal route, the aviation sector. And now, with the winter around the corner, even Europeans are struggling to deal with a second wave. In US, they call it fall, the period before the onset of the monsoon. And they're already fearing that I hope the fall literally doesn't translate into real sense that it causes fall. I hope it fall of number of cases, not a fall of healthcare system. But the fall season in US again is a cause of concern. And as that remains a concern and worry, aviation will be affected. So many countries are barring flights from the red zone countries, that are affected countries. And as you know, when there are travel bans in place, aviation will always be affected. Even India, we are not allowed the foreign travel to happen as it was happening before, inbound and outbound both, which again, as I said, affecting our domestic tourism sector very badly. A lot of layoffs, a lot of challenges. But all of this, therefore, was unprecedented and unexpected. And aviation industry has to pay a heavy financial price. And of course, till we address it adequately, properly, we'll not be able to get normalcy restored in very near future. So let me stop here because of the limited time that is allotted to me, and I have to also attend some more programs.
Sure.
I can thank you
Sure, sir.
for giving me this opportunity. Professor, I could not be the student of such a prestigious institution and certainly not qualified to be a professor like you.
Sir.
So the only way I could connect with such a prestigious institution is like a guest speaker, which I'm doing today. I hope you'll continue to invite me and I'll get an opportunity to interact with such a distinguished group of people, on both faculty as well as students, so that I will also be able to benefit from these associations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really
Thank you,
appreciate
sir.
the opportunity.
Your humility, I tell you, you are a very, reputable and very, very down to the earth person. We know it, and it's your greatness, and it's the institution, with which we belong. It's our pleasure that you are, with us and spoke to our students, and we will continue to be bothering you for the benefit of these young kids, because they are the future in the society, and they are the future of this country. And I'm sure this country has seen a lot of ups and downs, and aviation industry, as you said, has seen ups and downs, but I'm sure things will be much, much better in times to come, because we are all very, very hopeful and positive that economy and the industry will revive. Thank you very much, sir. uh, uh, any question, beta? If one or two question we can ask sir to be here for
Yes,
another
sir.
2 minutes.
Yes, sir. We now proceed with our questionnaire round, sir. Sir, we have shortlisted some questions from the chat box. Sir, what can be an effective
Please.
strategy for increasing the consumer demand for the air travels and making it affordable without compromising on the quality and features the air travel stands a symbol of?
Sorry.
So, what can be the
No,
effective
just Professor,
strategy?
can you repeat it, because I think I can hear you better.
Okay. Okay. Beta, तुम मुझे बताओ, and then I will repeat it. Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay. So, what can be the effective strategy for increasing the consumer demand for air travels without and making it affordable without compromising the quality and the features the air travel stands a symbol of?
Sure, sir. The question is basically how to increase the affordability factor, looking into the the health aspect in the airline industry. Like we are saying that 50% seats will be occupied. So how can we increase the revenues vis-a-vis? Yeah. Yes, sir.
No, I know this is a very important issue.
Yeah.
In fact, Professor Saab, as you correctly said, when you have 50% occupancy, that means obviously you don't have 50% revenue. And when, as you always see, that as you say in economics, there is something like a break-even point.
Right.
That when you are running any enterprise, if you do not have break-even point at which you cover fixed costs first completely, as well as you cover the variable cost. In case of airlines, there's a variable cost is fuel, but then there's also a huge fixed cost. There are lease rentals the airlines have to pay for the aircraft that they take, or they are already, if they're paid for it, then they have to pay, service the interest or the capital cost. Plus, there are huge variables besides fuel, which airport handling charges, staff salaries, and many others. So all of that, if that don't recover, the airlines will be very, very difficult phase. And in fact, honestly, not many airlines in the world, even before Corona, were making money. There are very few airlines which are making money. In fact, there is a very uniqueness about the aviation sector, is that airlines don't make too much money, though everybody else makes money because of airlines. Like the airports can make money because there are airlines. The catering people can make money because of airlines. The airline manufacturers of aircraft can make money because of airlines. But airlines themselves don't make money. It is like a spiritual leader who leads life for others, and actually he derives happiness by making others happy. So I think airlines, though we can never be called as spiritual leaders, but I think they make others make money, whereas they don't themselves make it. So I think safety is very important. At the same time, the profitability is other important. Now, how to have a trade-off and to have a fine balance is going to be very, very difficult for the airline. That is the reason, one of the reasons why airlines are bleeding. And in fact, there's a big problem all over the world. And unless you have a critical mass of, because say even British Airways is having a huge problem. They retrench or even laid off a lot of employees. Some airlines have become bankrupt. Like, the Virgin in Australia, I think they become filed for bankruptcy. So some of them are really, really in tab. So I think this is a very important issue. How to keep health, and if you want to keep health, as you correctly said, if you keep only 50% occupancy, then there is a problem. Like a cinema theater. Now, if you say that cinema theaters can operate only at 25-30% capacity, obviously they cannot make money. So it's a big problem that we have to ensure safety of people. That's a prime consideration for any public policy. At the same time, to ensure that those who provide a service to you also remain afloat. So how to do that is going to be a very, very challenging issue.
Some disturbance, beta. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, thank you for your great words, sir. It's been an honor to host you, sir. Now, on behalf of Finjin, the FIC of Ramanujan College would like to extend a hearty vote of thanks to you, sir, that you spared time from your busy schedule and graced the occasion. Today, we had an opportunity to hear your thoughts, and this will surely encourage us in our future events. A special mention to our principal, sir, Dr. S.P. Agrawal, for supporting us throughout to do our best. And not to mention our vice principal, sir, Dr. T.K. Mishra, K. Lakha ma'am, and Professor. Thank you once again, sir, and thank you to all our participants for being such a lovely audience.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank
sir.
you. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you,
and
sir.
all my young friends, thanks a lot. And one day I will physically visit your institution.
Sir, we will be very happy to host you, sir. Thank you very much.
I will do that. But
Sir,
really appreciate. Thank you very much.
Sir, it's a new institution, and you can see in the background, it's a new college recently built by RITES, one of the public sector undertaking, and we are very proud to have this.
By RITES?
Yes,
By
yes,
RITES?
sir.
Oh,
yes, sir.
I was a railway minister, and that was a mini accident.
That's right, sir. That's right, sir. That's right.
Thank you. So, then if it is built by RITES, then it is my right to come there.
Sure, sir. Please. We'll be very happy, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, अब कृपाल बात हो गया next से.
Sir, Viral Acharya sir is on board with us. I'm making him the host.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Absolutely, sir. Good evening.
Okay.
Good evening.
Sound is coming okay?
Yeah. Perfect, sir.
Okay.
Good evening,
right.
sir.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for
inviting me.
inviting me.
Principal of the college, sir.
Yes.
Please go ahead. बच्चों, start करो. Somebody is creating disturbance. सबको mute कराइए. Somebody has switched on its audio and there is a voice. सबको mute करिए आप. Host को बोलिए mute करे. Okay. Now you start. Let us start now. Parkhar, can we start?
Yes, sir, we are starting.
Okay.
Manifest your vision until it becomes a reality. Welcome to Rendezvous, India's largest seminar, the annual summit of FinGen, the Finance and Investment Society of Ramanujan College, Delhi University. A very hearty good evening to one and all present here. I, Aditi, on behalf of Team FinGen, really appreciate all of you for joining us. Today, I have the honor of welcoming our esteemed chief guest. It is better to be lucky, but I would rather be exact. Then when luck comes, you are ready. He was India's youngest deputy governor post-liberalization, an alumnus of IIT Bombay with a doctorate degree in finance from NYU Stern School of Business, an Indian economist who served as a member of the Advisory Council of the RBI Academy and was a member of the Academic Council of the National Institute of Security Markets Securities and Exchange Board of India. Not to my surprise, he's also written a couple of books based on finance. The proceeds of his books are donated to an NGO to improve India's primary education system. He feels there is no better way to give back to the society than contributing to the cause of education. He's currently the CV Star Professor of Economics in the Department of Finance at NYU. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Viral Acharya. Sir, before you begin, I would like to request our respected principal, sir, to brief you about our event. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to our special dignitary, Dr. Vimal Achari. Friends, it's our honor to welcome Viral Acharya, who has been the Deputy Governor as well as a noted economist and financial expert. Sir, it's really a fortune for this institution and these young guys that they invited you, and you will be sharing your wisdom with these future of the nation. SP Agarwal, principal of the college, once again welcome you on behalf of the institution. Actually, this college is a Delhi University maintained in South Delhi, and we have about 3,000 students. And our focus is on mathematical sciences, economics, management, and social sciences. We have about 100 faculty members and 100 other staff to support us. And in the series of these talks, we have been talking to various economists and financial experts, but today we are keen to listen to you on current economic scenario and financial stability. Basically, our concern is not only the COVID and the financial stability of this country. Uh, the whole world is suffering from this. It is not only this country, but US, Europe, and every other country, and probably some of the countries, the advanced countries, are much worse off than this country. Now, the question is that growth is one thing, but our problem is, of course, growth can come back, temporarily it might go down, but how to take care of the problem of our masses. Basically, what I'm talking is the education to all, the health to all, food, shelter, and clothing to all, and to take care of the downtrodden in the economy. That is the concern. If you can highlight some of the issues and solution to these problems rather than just the growth. So with this, once again, we welcome you, and we are keen to listen to you. And I'm sure with your presentation or the talk, these young minds will brighten further. Thank you very much, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Principal Sir, for this very kind introduction and context for perhaps how I could present my remarks. Thank you also to Ms. Agarwal for the kind introduction. Firstly, I just want to say that I hope all of you and your loved ones and families are doing well in these challenging times. I see that finally in the last 2 weeks, perhaps India's infection curve is on the mend. Numbers seem down from a peak of 100,000 new cases per day to, the last I saw was around 78,000. So on one day it had dipped down all the way to around 62,000 or something like that. I have a bit of a ritual I go through at my end. Every day I wake up, there's a phone just next to my bed. And as soon as I wake up, I first type India coronavirus cases. That's the first thing I type because I'm keen to see that the curve is actually coming down. And if I can just give you why I do that, I live in New York City. We didn't leave Manhattan. Manhattan, which is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, wasn't the worst affected, but New York City as a whole was perhaps one of the worst hotspots of the world. We had just within the city over 6,000 cases per day at peak, and over 600 deaths a day in mid-April. The good news is that it does come down. So keep your hopes up on the health front. The virus is not discriminating across the world. The good news about that is that just the way it has affected everyone, but then been kind to New York City in the last 3 months, it is going to be kind to others also in due course. But of course, as Principal Sir explained, the COVID shock has created massive disruptions in the economy. Perhaps those who face the most difficult life versus livelihood choices, those who can't just sit back at home as you and I are, and working from home, but those whose work necessarily involves being in contact with others, have really had the toughest of it all. Because paradoxically, when you and I sit at home, we don't spend as much. We don't require non-essential expenditures. As Mr. Prabhu was explaining, we aren't going to cinemas or theater. We aren't going as much to restaurants. So basically, we have cut back on a lot of our discretionary expenditures. And this is what creates jobs for actually those who are in more contact intensive industries. When I was in India, it was always explained to me that India B keeps India A more productive. And that's the key function that India B performs by taking away a lot of the tasks that India A would not like to perform on its own, so that India A can focus on its productivity. But if India B is not being deployed anymore by India A for many of these services, and I can tell you a lot of my technology friends, their businesses are booming during COVID, and they have not stepped out of their apartments. Their apartment complexes, because there are cases within the complex. They are worried about stepping out, and they can do everything they want for whichever part of the world, sitting in their offices with the fast broadband connection that they have. So I think Principal Sir is absolutely right that at the end of the day, it's not going to be about an interest rate cut here and there, or being able to channel liquidity to the formal parts of the economy. But it is really going to be about, can you ensure that the most affected citizens on the ground, who are actually very close to their consumption being only of essential expenditures. Poor don't actually spend too much beyond their essential expenditures. Small businesses who cannot survive the very difficult lockdown periods because they are not technologically set up to be connected to the larger businesses. And in any case, they require the physical infrastructure to be connected to the larger businesses. And third, the combination of the affected citizens at the lowest economic strata of the society and the small businesses, they are the hardest for the standard policy tools to reach. Typically, monetary policy, such as a cut in interest rates, hardly travels to the poor person in India directly. Of course, we have the fortune that the monsoon had been good, so the agri sector has been doing well. There have also been reforms in the farm sector that seem promising in terms of giving greater pricing power to the end farmers. But essentially, the picture I want to convey is that this is not about supporting, the largest corporations of India. Of course, they also employ labor in India B, but it is about getting the state and its capacity to be able to make transfers to those who are most affected and at the last mile, those for whom the formal economy, the bank credit mechanisms or the central bank policies don't necessarily travel that easily. This is true not just in India, this is true also in United States. I just saw an article in Wall Street Journal today morning that's talking about how COVID is crushing small businesses in the United States. In the United States, small businesses employ between 35 to 40% of the workforce of the country. They are very, very large. Actually, small businesses in United States employ a greater percentage of the workforce than they do in India, even though sometimes we think in India that small businesses are super important for the country. Actually, small businesses are even more important in the United States in terms of their workforce deployment. Again, the question is, of course, Federal Reserve has done a lot, but is it going to reach the small businesses directly? New York City is likely to see 160,000 restaurants shut down, possibly. That's a very, very large number of restaurants. 160,000 jobs are going to be lost in the New York City because of shutting down of restaurants. That's a very large number of jobs that's going to be lost in a very small part of the city. And many of these small businesses are unlikely to be able to come up in the near future again. So the question is, how do you ensure that the state has the capacity to actually support and restart some of these businesses going down the line? So what I'm going to propose is set what I believe is the need of the hour, which is that India must fix itself on its fiscal and financial stability fronts so that the state has the capacity to actually undertake necessary expenditures for COVID. It has the capacity to do so without destabilizing its borrowing programs over a period of time, and without therefore taking on significant economy risks in the process. And it has to also stabilize its financial sector, because what has happened traditionally with India's banking sector is that though we keep talking about development and financial inclusion, it has mostly focused on lending to the large industrial corporates. These loans have routinely gone bad. And when these loans go bad, instead of cleaning them up quickly, India has typically adopted a policy of kicking the can down the road, where you keep rolling over these bad debts of large industrial firms over and over again. And in the process, small businesses and individuals experience borrowing rates from banks which are way higher than they need to be, because banks are very reluctant to lend to them. They would rather lend to an old industrial firm that has gone sick, because they want to keep rolling over its loans so that they don't have to acknowledge that this firm hasn't paid them, and therefore there might be some regulatory requirements for injection of fresh capital, etc. This has been the history of our banking sector problems. They keep lending badly, and when they lend badly, the regulators, the government don't allow a cleanup that is very quick. The wounds keep festering on the balance sheets of the banks. And as that happens, instead of lending well to those who are healthy in the economy, instead they are willing to lend to the healthy only at higher costs, because they would rather give the money to what is called as zombie loans, which is loans to those firms which are walking dead. They should be dead, but they are still walking because no one has actually forced them into bankruptcy or resolved them in some meaningful manner. And they actually hog up the credit from the bank system. Now, if we continue in this way, as we try to recover out of COVID, we will have the same problem again. We won't be finding capital and lending into the hands of the healthy parts of the economy. So in my book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, I go through several speeches that I had given as a deputy governor, where these were some of the key themes as to why the government is trying to do too much, but not much of what it should be doing, which is provision of healthcare, education, and infrastructure, so that on the ground, smaller businesses actually have higher productivity in India than what we currently have. Second, I lay out all the banking sector problems and some ways to get around it. And there is a big preface chapter which is called Fiscal Dominance, a theory of everything in India, which explains that what is happening in India is that the central bank especially is getting fiscally dominated, which is that the government's fiscal pressures are always the most important agenda item on the table for the economy. How is the government going to roll over its debt? In most of last 3 years, I think there hasn't been a single quarter where this isn't actually the topic of the discussion. Will the government's borrowing program for the rest of the year roil the bond markets and cause the bond market yields to rise? Now, when you are perpetually in such a scenario, it means that the government finances are always on the brink. They are always being managed too tightly. In the preface chapter, I give the example of a rubber band that is always stretched so tightly to do its work that it can actually snap at any point with a little bit of pressure that's getting applied. Now, what is the way out? The way out is to actually employ either a bigger rubber band. So you need to have more strength in the rubber band. So you need to grow the economy, or you need to actually figure out other ways of creating, fixing whatever that you are trying to keep together. But what happens in India is that the government, instead of strengthening this rubber band, strengthening the growth, focusing on long run inner strength of this packaging around the economy, it's constantly turns to the central bank and says, why don't you do the heavy lifting? Why don't you cut rates? What's the problem? Why don't you provide liquidity to the rest of the system? Why do we need to recognize bank losses? Why can't we recognize them in 3 years down the line? All of these are very convenient ways of postponing the problems that the government needs to deal with in reorienting its expenditures to what the economy truly needs, because it doesn't want to cut back on what I would call as populist short-term programs, which give tremendous political popularity, but don't always give inner strength to the economy to survive well on its own in the long run. So, in my view, this form of fiscal dominance is best addressed if we actually restore the health of the fiscal side on the economy, the government balance sheet, and the financial sector, the banking side, so that the central bank is not the one that is constantly doing the heavy lifting. Because when it does that, it gets distracted from its long term goals. It doesn't focus as much on price stability or inflation. If that happens, then people start investing in real estate and gold, because financial savings get eroded when you have very high inflation. The joke goes in Latin America, where inflation is very high, that inflation is very high when it's better to pay the cab driver when you get into the cab rather than when you are getting out, because in between the time your money has actually eroded in value because the cab fare would have increased at a very fast rate in that time. So you don't want to be in this situation, because when that happens, people actually don't want to use money for transactions. They want to use real estate, gold, and other kinds of commodities become the preferred savings for finances. Second, it gets distracted from protecting the interests of depositors. If interest rates are low, if banks are not being kept healthy in a true economic sense, but they are just being managed in an optical or accounting sense, then depositor interests are not safe as well. And if inflation is high, but interest rates are kept low, it means the depositors are earning very low real yields on their savings. Because by the time you withdraw your deposits, so much more money is going to be required to buy whatever you wanted, that the real value of your savings in the banking sector has been eroded. So the need of the hour, in my view, to deal with COVID is to fix the fiscal and the financial sector of the economy. And what I'll do is offer a little bit of a blueprint for going about doing this. On the fiscal side, in order to undertake relief-related transfers and long overdue capital investments, interestingly, what the government needs to do is to stretch the fiscal a bit further for now. But as I said, the only way you can stretch that rubber band is if you create more strength in it. So how can the government create more strength? It needs to do so without losing credibility with investors and markets, that in the medium term, its rubber band is going to be very stable. This rubber band shouldn't break while it is doing a short-term stretch to meet the COVID-related expenditures. What would these expenditures be? In most countries where fiscal policy is being used, it is a direct benefit transfer to the most poor people in the country. In the United States, there's a $600 per week. Now, United States is very rich. They can make a much larger transfer to the poor people, but commensurate with what the government spending capacity might be, it might want to consider, for instance, some transfer along these lines. So what are the fiscal measures? I'm going to talk about 5 measures. The first point is that a fiscal consolidation path for the medium term needs to be earnestly put in place to achieve reasonable debt to GDP and fiscal deficit targets for 3 to 5 years. Now, these targets have been recommended in the past by the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act of 2003. This act was reviewed in 2016. And several analysts estimate that even under mild stress assumptions, India's debt to GDP numbers might grow in the range of 80 to 90% because the growth is actually not going to be that strong in 2021. So, in some sense, everyone knows that our medium term path is going to be difficult. And yet, the government needs to give confidence that as and when growth recovers, we will make corrective adjustments. Now, in the past, as I said, we have had these targets, but the government has never met them in a true economic sense. And this leads to my second point, that merely having these targets in place has not sufficed for ensuring adherence or lack of fiscal slippage. Even in the pre-COVID era, we were slipping 2 to 3 years in a row, even in the pre-COVID era. And this was being done through what I call as fiscal jugaad. What is fiscal jugaad? Fiscal jugaad is you find out on balance sheet versus off balance sheet transactions. You get one public sector enterprise to acquire another public sector enterprise and pay a dividend to the government. Expenditures that should have happened before the budget is announced, so before 31st January, get postponed to after 31st January or March, depending on what the accounting year is. But all of this is just musical chairs. You are either expenditures are truly not coming down. All that you are doing is you are adjusting where it is recorded and what time it is recorded in. Okay, so this is all just accounting jugglery that is done to show that when the number is announced, it looks close to what the target is. But the true number, the markets and everyone knows, is actually quite different. So what we need is an objective monitoring of consolidated debt and deficit numbers of the government. And how can one achieve this? You cannot entrust the responsibility of objective monitoring to the finance ministry itself, because it's like trying to regulate your own self, and that doesn't work very well. Sometimes you need a doctor to tell you what you should do for your health regime. The same way, we need an independent bipartisan fiscal council, as in many other countries, which will report to the parliament and not to the finance ministry. It should hold a mirror to the government's annual progress on these FRBM targets. The 13th Finance Commission and the FRBM Review Committee of 2016, they recommended the appointment of fiscal council, but reporting to the finance ministry. Such a council will not be independent and is bound to fail when it is needed the most. Instead, we should adopt what the 14th Finance Commission, chaired by former RBI Governor Dr. Y.V. Reddy, recommended, which is that it's the parliament that should appoint the fiscal council. It can be bipartisan, it can even be non-partisan, it can just be entirely technocratic if it is so desired. And its assessment should be tabled in both the houses of parliament. Now, in countries where such a council is there, let me explain how it works. So in India, what happens is when the budget is announced, government programs are announced. So many thousand crores are being allocated for this government program, that government program. And they present numbers on how much is going to be the expenditure. None of these numbers are vetted by anyone. There is no audit before the programs are decided. See, budget is a mapping of the strategy of the program into the financials, right? Any organization has a strategy and then it has a budget. The budget is a financial reflection of what the strategy is going to entail. So someone has to vet whether what you are announcing in the budget is indeed a reasonable cost of the program that is being announced or not. So in United States, for example, since 1974, there is a Congressional Budget Office that vets all of the government's programs before they are announced and also afterwards as to whether the expenditures were in line with what was announced or not. The same way government's borrowings, as I explained, are sometimes on balance sheet, they're off balance sheet. The Fiscal Council should hold a mirror on all of these aspects to the government. And if the government deviates in its budget from the recommendations of the Fiscal Council, the council should have legislative authority to require that the budget explain why it did not comply with the council's recommendations. One of the big numbers in our budget calculations is what is going to be economy's growth over the next year, because that determines the tax revenues of the government. Right now, the way things work is that government decides how much to spend, and then to ensure it is sticking to the targets, it picks a growth number that will generate the required level of revenues. Sometimes these growth numbers are so phenomenally high that you know the budget is going to be an overstretch ahead of time. But right now, there is no authority to actually require the government to explain as to how did you come about with this growth number. And that discussion has to start before the budget is announced rather than after the budget is announced. Third, regardless of whether an independent fiscal council is set up, India needs an improved disclosure standard for the government expenditure and deficit. Right now, there is just tremendous level of obfuscation or fiscal jugaad, as I called it. In fact, Dr. Reddy, in his masterful foreword to my book, he explains that in India, we have what is called as a real deficit and an official deficit. Now, if the gap between official and real deficit is not very large, then it's all right. You know, there are some adjustments made every now and then, but you can still mainly focus on the official deficit. But the center's official deficit right now is about half of its real deficit. That means the error in the official deficit is as large as the level of the official deficit itself. Now, when you have such a large gap, you have to talk about both the official deficit and the real deficit all the time. Now, of course, this is not desirable because it means that the government is not leaving any capacity for fiscal expenditures should a shock like COVID arise, because it is always like a stretched rubber band at all times, even in relatively calm years. So we need to measure and state publicly what is the total government expenditure and deficit, not just on balance sheet of the center and the states, but also what is happening through off balance sheet transactions. How much is on the Food Corporation of India balance sheet? Where did that come from? If it came from the National Small Savings, that is an extra budgetary borrowing. How much is being borrowed through public sector enterprises and then being transferred to the government as a dividend? Public sector enterprises are backed by the center or the states. So in a consolidated government balance sheet or the national balance sheet, that should be recognized as a public sector borrowing requirement as a whole. Who should do this? This should ideally be done by the Comptroller and Auditor General Office of India. They seem to be the best position to provide this all-important aggregate statistic. It should be provided on an annual basis. Perhaps the CAG can even make the components available to market analysts so that they can see which are the points of specific fiscal slippages, and that way reduce the accounting slate or jugaad that is presently making it very hard to keep tabs on the fiscal balance in normal years, making it very hard to undertake fiscal accommodation in years such as COVID. Fourth, and the next 2 points are really crucial in the short run as well, which is that 90% of the central government's annual budget in India is allocated to revenue expenditures. So basically it's salaries, pensions, and subsidies. And these don't have long-run fiscal multiplier on growth. They don't actually, they add to the expenditure every year, but they don't have a fiscal multiplier. It's not that when you give a rupee of subsidy, it translates into a massive growth for the economy down the line. Is this the best use of government's capacity to spend? when you look at state budgets, there is a greater allocation to capital expenditures, but even there, 70% of the budget is on revenue expenditures. India has been quite unique in that this has been the composition of India's fiscal expenditures over a long period of time. A lot of economists, therefore, have been recommending that subsidies need to be rolled back upon, and we need to convert them into a single universal basic income that is transferred directly to the citizens. Now, let me explain why this is important. Think about food subsidies. Okay, when you think about food subsidies, what image comes to mind? That government is procuring food and distributing it at the last mile. Yes, it is. But there is a whole machinery that's involved along the way. There is Food Corporation of India. It runs big godowns and warehouses all over the country. When it procures, it needs to finance itself in the market. It has to pay an interest cost on this borrowing. So when you see the food subsidy bill of the government, that entire bill is not the actual transfer which is reaching the poor person in the form of food in the country. There's a whole host of leakage along the way, which is in the operations of these enterprises, in their borrowing costs, in the storage and the wastage that happens along with it, and several other dissipation of value that may be happening. Of course, there may be just time value of money that's getting lost in the process sometimes as well. So all of the question is, why not simply give direct money to the end citizen? Now, 15 years back, this was perhaps not possible. But today, we have unique identifiers for a big part of the population in the form of Aadhaar or PAN. In the form of Jan Dhan Yojana accounts, we have bank accounts for most citizens. And so to the extent where it is possible, why not compress the wastage of the subsidy rollouts into a smaller revenue expenditure, free up space in the government budget for expenditures towards health infrastructure, education, and especially infrastructure, all of which are shown in a variety of India and foreign studies to have huge long-run multipliers on growth. When you spend a rupee on infrastructure, it crowds in private sector investment. It crowds in other growth. Think about building, say, a Mumbai to Delhi industrial corridor and providing beautiful infrastructure along the way. That will lead to development on the sides of the infrastructure corridor, housing, etc. And that's going to give a huge fillip to the economy in terms of job creation and so on. Of course, having witnessed COVID, we fully understand the need for a better health infrastructure. And again, it's a public good where perhaps the government could spend a lot more if it's not spending so much on subsidies on a variety of other fronts. And fifth, as I said, every quarter of the last several years, the talk of the town in the markets is, can the government do its borrowing without upsetting the yield curve, without increasing borrowing costs for everyone else in the economy? This means the government is borrowing too much. Is there a way for the government to raise finances in other mechanisms which don't amount to just fiscal jugaad? And there is one important way which seems forgotten, which is that during 1998 to 2003, India undertook a massive divestment program. We were a nationalized economy in 70s and 80s. So Indian government owns large enterprises all over the country. In fact, you can have a beautiful darshan of your city, be it New Delhi or Mumbai, going and observing what real estate is owned in the city by which government-owned enterprise. And in thriving pockets of India, where real estate would be so valuable, there is real estate owned by government enterprises, which is just lying waste. Nothing is happening there because many of these enterprises are sick. They are sitting on land, which is very valuable, that others could actually deploy for productive use. And at a minimum, the government can auction these pieces out and raise revenues. More broadly, government can shed its stake below majority and divest its presence in so many of the sectors. And this way, it would actually allow a part of the salary and the pension cost to be transferred to the private sector. It will allow these public sector enterprise to have market-driven private governance and performance standards. If they have to be listed on a stock exchange and raise financing, they will at least have to start disclosing their reports on an annual basis, which are of high quality. And they will modernize, they will digitize, they will use technology, etc. And this way, you would have unleashing of the repressed potential of the human capital in these sectors. More importantly, such divestments will reduce the pressure on the government borrowing program, as government will be raising equity rather than debt that doesn't need repayment on an ongoing basis. So India can't just use measures to collect more and more taxes. Of course, it has to do that, but it has to find a way of actually doing more with whatever it has access to funds right now. In many cases, actually, the government needs to do less. Take the form of subsidies as an example. Why not just give the money directly to at the last mile rather than give it in the form of this wasteful transfer of a commodity which requires a whole infrastructure and that has a lot of seepage costs along the way. Let me now turn to the financial sector. One problem in India has always been, as I can't belabor more and more, is that we keep justifying the presence of public sector banks, saying, oh, we need them for development and financial inclusion. But I can tell you that even at the last mile, the depositor doesn't want to put their money that much into public sector banks anymore. During the time where I was at the Reserve Bank of India, I used to regularly ask my driver and mate, what is the quality of the service that your banks are providing you? And many of the times when they complained, it was always about the performance of some of these public sector banks because they are so strapped for capital. They have so much legacy loan problem that they are no longer able to provide high quality, high technology, high variety depositor and saving service to the end customer. So as I explain in my preface chapter, which I said is titled Fiscal Dominance, a Theory of Everything in India, uh, while improving the fiscal condition itself will actually improve things, uh, there is a need for the government not to pressurize the central bank too much so that the central bank can actually deal with the banking sector in a way that it ideally should, and it can then keep protecting depositor interests, among other things. And what is the way out? When it comes to buying property, they say your criterion should be location, location, location. That's all you should buy your property on the basis of. When it comes to securing financial stability, in the criterion they say should be capital, 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 which is there should be enough shareholder capital, private investment in a bank that will absorb the losses when losses arise so that depositors are not at risk. And more importantly, those who are running the bank, the boards, the management, and the shareholders have enough skin in the game so that when losses materialize, they are the ones who will bear these losses rather than passing on the losses to depositors and ultimately to the taxpayers through the deposit insurance mechanism. Why has this not worked in India? Because we have public sector banks. If we have public sector banks, who is the principal shareholder? It's the government. Why does the government not put in enough capital or skin in the game into these banks? Because it has too many other programs to run, and it has never done enough capital allocation to run a stable banking sector. What is the cost of all this? The cost of all this is that our banks are always economically short on capital. Those who are running the bank don't have enough skin in the game. The boards are not empowered. There are not terrible consequences when loans go bad. If anything, the government keeps telling the banks very often which sectors to lend the money to. So banks are not even trying to design their own business model. It's a business model that's thrust upon them from somewhere else. And once these loans go bad, they are simply evergreening the bad loans or simply buying government bonds. What should happen is that they should be seeking out better underwriting standards and lending to the healthier parts of the economy. But once they have a legacy loan problem, they simply don't do this. So what's the way out? Again, 5 steps. First, India needs to uphold Basel capital and liquidity norms in their full spirit. Right now, what happens is on paper, we adopt them in full spirit, and then every year we start carving out some exceptions. Exceptions for loans to real estate, exceptions for loans to small and medium sized enterprises. They are not even with sunset clauses. In case of MSME sector, we have been giving a forbearance package on recognition of bad loans every year since 2016. Now, if a sector is underperforming for 5 years, it is not a cyclical problem. It's a structural problem. There must be something as to why textile mills in India are not able to produce as many shirts per day as the textile mills in Bangladesh are. Uh, why is it? Why is that the case? So that deeper question never gets asked because the central bank is always providing a soft lending on this sector. The true problems of the sectors never rise to the top because we just keep kicking the can down the road by allowing them to borrow without ever repaying these loans and facing consequences for that. I'm not saying that we should be hard on the sector. What I'm trying to say is that the central bank actually delays the recognition of the fact that this sector is no longer globally competitive. It's not able to compete in the exports market for providing shirts and pants because it's lost its productivity to new emerging players such as Bangladesh in this sector. That's one. Second, how to deal with the legacy loans problem. We did an asset quality review for the banks in 2014-15. It got completed 2 years later, but this was mainly for the large corporate loans. As I told you, every year India figures out some new category of sector to give forbearance and restructuring relief to. So India needs an annual asset quality review because otherwise we are perpetually in this cycle of kicking the can down the road. How do you do this? The way the developed economies have done this now since the global financial crisis is to do what are called as macroprudential stress tests. It's a fancy term, but the basic idea is very simple. Imagine you are building a bridge across a river and engineers are designing the standards for these bridges. They are not going to approve the building of a bridge that's going to collapse the first time that there is a hurricane or a cyclonic wind that's coming about. They will build fair amount of robustness in the trusses that are being put into the bridge so that even when a hurricane or a cyclone comes, the bridge will actually stay in its place and those vehicles which got stuck are still able to use the bridge to go across. Financial bridges also need to be built with the same level of robustness. What is the financial sector? It's a bridge from the savers in the economy to the borrowers on the economy. Banks, housing finance companies, gold loan companies, non-bank finance companies. These are all financial bridges that take savings from one side of the economy to borrowers who can put it to productive use on the other side of the economy. These bridges need to be built with high levels of robustness. Where does the robustness come from? It comes from shareholders' skin in the game. How much capital are they putting up? Now, how do you determine how much capital is enough? You have to subject the bridges in a hypothetical stress scenario. What if macroeconomy has a very significant downturn? What kind of loan losses will arise? Can the shareholders absorb the losses with the amount of shareholder capital that they have put up? If not, the bridge is not ready to perform financial intermediation. Okay, that's the approach the global central banks are taking. That's the best standard right now. And at a minimum, the Reserve Bank of India, which already does the stress tests, but doesn't use it to determine the capital requirements, it simply produces these results in a financial stability report. The Reserve Bank of India should take this forward and use the stress tests to fortify the banks and the non-banks with adequate capital so that they can withstand the tough winds of a macro downturn. Third, and again, most crucial, the government has to now get out of banking, in my opinion. It's been 40 to 50 years since banks were nationalized. there is nothing positive to write about. Why were the banks nationalized? They were nationalized because the claim of the government of that time was that, oh, they are lending mainly to industrial firms. They are not lending to the welfare, to create welfare of the economy at the last mile. Lo and behold, however, public sector banks raked up losses of over 8 trillion rupees by lending to the large industrial firms over the last 2 decades. So why did we need to nationalize them in the first place? They were lending to industrial firms prior to their nationalization in the first place. What is worse is that the governance of these public sector banks has become so weak that the boards and the management don't have adequate empowerment. There is a common business model that gets thrust upon them through the Department of Financial Services. And at convenient times in the electoral cycle, there is a push for simply increasing lending to meet certain targets so that even if growth is weak in an underlying sense, you can pump prime the economy for 6 to 12 months so that you can show some adequate activity at the time of the turning points of the electoral cycle. Since 90s, RBI has commissioned many committees. First, the Narsimham Committee in the 90s, and then ending with the PJ Nayak Committee in 2014. All of these committees have said the government must divest stakes below majority to 25 to 30%. All of these committees have recommended that the Department of Financial Services should actually be shut down, and all of the government stakes should be moved into a holding company which only empowers the board through objective appointment of professionals and then lets the boards run these banks rather than the government actually intervening and interfering in these banks. Unsurprisingly, after every committee has proposed a smaller role for Department of Financial Services, the role of Department of Financial Services has actually increased after every report that has come out saying it should be abolished. But that's how bureaucracy works. The other thing that's important is that once the boards are empowered, perhaps some of these banks need to reprioritize their business models. Why are they all universal banks? If they can't even make a small loan well, why are they lending to the largest industrial firms of the country? Maybe they should become microcredit or microfinance institutions that focus on financial inclusion, lending to micro entrepreneurs at the last mile. This is a profitable activity if done well because the demand for credit is very high. India's credit to GDP is between 55 to 60% after 50 years of having nationalized banks. This is low even by emerging market standards. So clearly this experiment has failed and we need to move out of it in a well-calibrated, comprehensive strategy. Fourth, the central bank, by legal statute, is not allowed certain powers as far as public sector banks is concerned. There have been problems of governance in private banks. What has the central bank done? It has basically got rid of the top management, which has been problematic. And while one can quibble whether the timing of that has been correct or not, at least the rogue management is out of these banks. In case of public sector banks, the central bank has no such powers. In case of private banks that have gone rogue, the central bank has been able to ask the shareholders to chip in more capital to absorb losses. With public sector banks, the government has no power, the central bank has no powers to do this because the principal shareholder is the government and the government cannot be forced to dilute its stake under the present statute. So there is an act called the Bank Nationalization Act, which overrides the Bank Regulation Act and therefore compromises the central bank's powers in dealing with public sector banks. Regulation of banks should be ownership neutral. Doesn't matter if you're a public sector bank or a private bank, the central bank, which is the depositor's delegated authority to maintain the value of the deposits with the highest sanctity, should be able to apply the same rules and be able to discipline the management and boards when they have failed in performing their duty towards the bank. Finally, and this is also equally important, inflation in India is rising high. It was high even before pre-COVID because of food price inflation. Since then, supply side pressures have built up and they have led to further upward revision in inflation expectations of households, both at home and abroad. Now, at a time when fiscal deficits are going to rise, real interest rates are negative because the central bank has to accommodate in order to support growth. And liquidity conditions are very, very loose because the central bank is trying to desperately try and get banks to lend more. There is a risk that inflation could run away very quickly. Because I can tell you from talking to my mom, and I call it the Pav Bhaji index, what is the cost of tomatoes, potatoes, and onions? For an average household in India, the notion of inflation is tied to this Pav Bhaji index. It determines what you think is the state of inflation in the economy, how inflation is going to rise in the economy. And therefore, you find that when RBI does the household inflation expectation survey, food prices play a very crucial role in household expectations. And what happens is that when household inflation expectations rise, they may be caused by higher prints of food inflation. So, the fact that you are paying more to the food vendor when you are buying the ingredients of pav bhaji, as I call it. Or maybe the fuel prices have risen because the government is raising excise duty in order to collect more taxes for its programs, etc. Once you see the higher prices, it raises expectations of higher wages. In case of fuel prices, it also increases the cost of freight, and through that, it creates a cost push inflation into the product of the goods that are sold in the economy because it has become costlier actually to move them around within the country. Now, in times such as this, when inflation is rising, what you need is that investors, domestic investors and foreign investors, they should not lose confidence that the central bank is getting distracted. They should not lose confidence that the central bank is focused on inflation. If central bank is seen as sidestepping and bypassing inflation objectives and basically focused on taking care of troubled banks or helping the government roll over its debt financing, and if it does so on a slippery path, again and again and again, the central bank can lose its credibility. So let's think about what would that mean. It would mean that foreign investors who between bonds and equities have perhaps invested anything between 800 billion to $1 trillion in India will start worrying that the real value of the dollars that I have sent in India is getting eroded because inflation is rising very quickly. That's going to cause rupee to depreciate. And so when I move my money out of India, if I do it at a very depreciated rupee, I won't get much dollars back. So I have to do it quickly. As soon as I see that the central bank is not focused on inflation, external investors will start pulling out the dollar money that they have put into India. India is on the margin financed by the rest of the world. In the last few quarters, the imports have collapsed and we have a positive balance of payment scenario, which is that we are not actually being financed by the rest of the world because we aren't actually doing much. We haven't been consuming much in the last COVID quarters. But this will reverse because on balance, India is growing faster than the rest of the world. So we need to raise financing from the rest of the world inside. But if you lose inflation credibility of the central bank, at some point they will start pulling their money out in what is called as a sudden stop. So what is the defense against this? The defense against this is our flexible inflation targeting framework, where the central bank is supposed to stick to its objective of maintaining inflation at 4% in a band of 2 to 6% with the policy repo rate, that is its instrument. And of course, there's an exception given that you can make adjustments for supporting growth. The question is, the central bank has to ensure that it's making adequate corrections every now and then to rein in inflation so that this credibility is preserved and India doesn't end up with an external sector crisis. So in my view, even though growth is weak, it cannot be supported at a complete erosion of the credibility of the central bank. And this means that the flexible inflation targeting framework needs to be persevered with going forward. So let me end. There was a time when every time I was in India. This was in 80s, etc. If you asked anyone, why does India only produce the ambassador car? And the answer you would get is it's because that is the only car that is appropriate for the quality of our roads. Now, with all its current imperfections, Indian roads have improved. As a result, we don't just produce the ambassador car, we produce better cars. We also import better foreign cars. And it's time to recognize that just the way some of these parts of the economy have modernized, India's financial sector and regulations also need to be modernized. We continue to be working as though we are in 70s and 80s, when the government, the central bank, and the public sector banks were what is called as a Hindu undivided family in which no one kept anyone's proper accounts. Now, that time we were a centralized, nationalized economy. We were generating 3 to 3.5% of what is called as the Hindu rate of growth. That's not good enough for the modern India economy, for the demographics, and the aspirations of our youth. We need to create more than 1 million jobs every month. And you can't do that if you grow at that centralized, nationalized era of 3.5%. So I think COVID to me is an opportunity. It's, of course, a very painful human shock on the ground. But viewed in a positive way, it's an opportunity to recognize that we have been having imbalances build up in our fiscal and the financial sector of the economy. On the fiscal, we are doing too much without being honest about it. And we have never saved space for a shock like COVID, where we would need to support the most affected citizenry of the country. On the financial sector side, we have been lending to again and again to the larger and larger industrial firms without much due diligence and quality of underwriting. And again, we have not been honest about dealing with these losses. What we need to do is to now restore fiscal and financial stability, commit to bringing them back to where they need to be over the medium term. This requires laying out a blueprint of the required economic and financial bridges, and then we have to build them pebble by pebble, but with some transformational reforms. As I said, these bridges need to be very robust, and they should be able to withstand the hurricanes of future, so that the bridges can channel savings from one shore to the most productive users who are waiting their arrival at the other end. Let me end with an analogy that I like the most. Sometimes when I propose all this, everyone says, do you really think an economy should be reforming in the midst of COVID? See, COVID is very disruptive. So sometimes when I think about a spider, sometimes a spider's web gets destroyed. It could be because of wind. It could be because the web was built on the wall of a home, and someone cleaning the home decided that the web looks ugly and I need to clean it up. Now the spider has to build its web all over again. If you have ever noticed, the first point of the building of a web of a spider is not an incremental step. A naturalist explained this to me once. The spider has to squat on its thighs, and actually it uses all the strength that it has in its thighs to move from where it is sitting over to a point on the other wall. It has to make a big leap in order to build that first string of the web that it needs to build. So it goes from point A to point B, where it has to build and connect the web with all the strength that it has in its thighs. Once that first bridge has been built across, it's very easy for the spider to actually build the rest of the web, because now it has a backbone, it has a solid foundation around which this web is going to be built. In the same way, it's my view that it's only in the midst of a crisis that these kinds of reforms not only are required, but they need to be undertaken using all the strength, all the reforms that the economy can bring to the table, because you want to first lay down a path from point A to point B. That gives confidence to the investors, and it becomes very easy then to actually grow the rest of the economy around it. let me stop here and take some questions if there's time. I encourage you all to look at the book if you have time. I think there is a lot of good economics in it. Of course, I'm biased, but you can judge for yourself when you read. I've tried to keep it reasonably simple. I like to explain things from first principles. So many of the speeches start out laying out the groundwork in a very common sense kind of a way. And then, of course, as I was a deputy governor, I had to get into the specifics of what kind of reforms may be necessary. Much of that agenda is unfinished, and therefore I called it a quest for restoring financial stability. So many of the speeches are still relevant. And the preface chapter, which is called The Fiscal Dominance, is an entirely new spin of how fiscal dominance works in an emerging market. So I hope you find it a useful read in one way or the other.
Well, Mr. Acharya, you have been able to showcase the perspective in a very lucid and simple manner. That was the beauty of the whole thing. And for that matter, I would like to congratulate my students, the organizers who have been able to invite you and, have such a wonderful lecture. I'm very proud of my students for that matter. One thing that irks me slightly, that when you talked about, you favored privatization of bank. In that context, would you would you please highlight how to have a check on people like Chanda Kochar or Rana Kapoor? That apart, there are several hidden charges of these private banks. And if people have, one alternative, that whether they can go to the private banks or the public banks, then what is harm in that? So on that, I would like you to throw some light. How to check all such wrongdoings in the private banks?
Thank you, sir. See, if you observe all over around the world, it's not that private banks in other countries don't make mistakes. They also have rogue management. Just 2 years back, there was a fraud at Wells Fargo, where a very large number of fraudulent accounts were created all over the United States by some parts of the internal management to show that they are creating a lot of customer accounts, for example. As you know, in the lead up to the global financial crisis, a large number of banks in the United States made fraudulent mortgages, and the whole housing boom and bust happened thereafter. I think the key point to me is not that we be able to prevent all kinds of such errant behavior. I think the key question to me is, the question I ask is, I don't want to take any specific names, but whoever you consider as rogue management inside the private banks, the point is that when the problem is detected, they are out. Once the problem is detected, once the regulator has adequate proof that we can convince the internal financial stability board of the central bank that indeed this management renewal should not happen, because you cannot do it. You can't have a heavy-handed intervention by a regulator without foolproof evidence that there has been errant behavior. But once that happens, the management is out. As soon as the new management comes in, you can see what happens. The first thing that they do is recognize whatever has not been recognized as bad loans by the previous management. And second, they bring in adequate capital into the bank, because they want to start the bank with a clean chit from then on. Because whatever happens thereafter, the new management wants to be seen as their performance rather than an overhang of the legacy of the past CEO. So you take Axis Bank, you take ICICI Bank, you take Yes Bank. All of these banks are now in hands of newer management, newer shareholder, newer investors. And this is the important response that is, or feedback that is required in the system. The problem with public sector banking is that this feedback is missing, because the principal shareholder is the government, and the regulator can't hold the government responsible. The regulator can't hold management responsible either, because the management decisions are made in the Department of Financial Services. They are not actually made by the regulator. Now, this to me is one of the central problems, that the government needs to distance itself from the operations and the governance of the public sector banks. And so it needs to reduce its stakes below majority. So it is not the principal shareholder. There should be other shareholders who also have significant stakes, maybe 10%, 15% stakes. These may be financially qualified, technically qualified, large institutional investors who have run successful banks in other parts of the world or within India. There are many Indian banks who have right now, who are also well run in the private banking space. So, some of these could be holding stakes over here. Second, the board members need to be appointed with the understanding that they are the ones who will be responsible for the strategy of the bank. That's the job of the board. Right now, the board sees itself as essentially executing what's a strategy of the bank that's decided at the Department of Financial Services. Now, you can't have this much intervention into the banking function and then expect that we will have nimble banks. One, all public sector banks start looking very similar because they are all given the same targets and the same quotas. Very often, because you are mostly wanting people who will rubber stamp decisions and not actually have adequate questioning or empowerment. And simultaneously, they will be subject to investigations if something goes wrong. You find it very hard to appoint adequate number of people in this position. Many times board positions are empty, executive director positions are empty. Why are we putting such a huge deposit franchise of the country into institutions that we cannot even staff properly? That's going to lead to serious problems of attention and adequate responsibility and empowerment of the decisions that's taking place. So I would say that, ultimately you have to ask the question, okay, there are problems. At the end of the day, the private banks are still valued in the market at higher price to book earnings ratio than public sector banks are. Price to book ratio of public sector banks is between 0.3 to 0.6. It means actually that the book value is overstated because the market is saying the value is, I would not pay you even the book value of the shares of these banks, the market is saying. So you have not recognized losses. Also, the market is saying the growth potential is very weak. I don't expect you to be able to do much intermediation business and generate revenues because you are not even going to be able to generate more than your book value. In contrast, top 15 institutions in the country by price to book ratio are all private banks. And by the way, when I said public sector banks, I'm including public sector housing finance companies, public sector power finance companies. They all have extremely low price to book ratios. So my view is that we have to accept that in a market-based economy, in a capitalist economy, there will be failures. That's a property of a market-based economy. People take risks and they fail. The question is whether there's enough feedback in the system to replace them with better players over a period of time. And as long as that happens, the system will be able to generate value along the way. In public sector banks, I describe the situation as stagnation and festering of the wounds. On the one hand, we don't have any poster child there. But on the other hand, it is actually not of much value in the first place. And I think that's the paradox that we have to fix. The question we raise, in fact, I'm going to share on the chat session an article that we have just written. Professor Raghuram Rajan from University of Chicago and we have provided a blueprint for reforms in the financial sector. And what it's trying to explain is that we need to move the system to a better place. And the first step to do this is that perhaps the government needs to become an arm's length owner of public sector banks rather than the principal shareholder. It needs to distance itself. And to do that, one way we suggest is that perhaps the Department of Financial Services can be shut down. And instead, you can have the Bank Boards Bureau to be empowered so that it just appoints these board members who are actually much, much more powerful. It's a different governance structure. But we are with you, which is that to assume that we can simply privatize these banks and everything is going to be hunky-dory is also wrong. We do need good governance mechanisms in place. We will need good boards in place. The central bank will still need to keep a tab on whether the management is actually running rogue or not. And then, therefore, it needs the powers to be able to discipline this management. So if the Bank Nationalization Act is not altered, but the government simply gives up its powers over these banks, then, then no one is in charge of the baby, so to speak. Neither the RBI will have the powers, nor the central bank, nor the government will then have the adequate attention to deal with the problem. So what I've done is in the chat room, I have actually shared the link to this article with Professor Raghuram Rajan, which gives a blueprint of how we think we could move from public sector banking towards reprivatization in a calibrated manner, so that first we improve governance and then we actually reprivatize these banks only after that critical step is undertaken.
I think well said, sir, and I'm fully convinced with your suggestions on that.
Any other questions from the students?
Any other question?
Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure having you with us. So my question for today is that there's a news around the corner that the Supreme Court and government is working on waiving of interest for banks. So, sir, my question is that don't you think that banks will strive to death for those banks in which customers have already opted for moratorium?
Yes, so I haven't looked at the full nitty-gritty of the package, but I think what the government is saying is that if the compounding of the interest on those who have taken the moratorium is forgiven, then the government will pay the banks for the compounding that is forgiven. Now, see, viewed one way or the other, it is basically a fiscal transfer. What it's saying is that the fiscal transfer will go to those who have basically chosen to actually not repay their loans. Now, one question someone may ask is, why should it be that those who chose to avail of the moratorium get the benefit of not having to pay the compounding? You could argue perhaps they are more affected. But of course, there could be strategic players who have chosen to default even if they could, and they might think it's a freebie. See, therefore, personally, I always prefer that a fiscal action is in the form of a direct transfer. You give money to the households, you let them decide what they want to do with it. Do they want to spend on education? Do they want to spend on health? Do they want to spend on repaying the banks, etc.? Now, banks, whether we like it or not, coming out of COVID, the world over, banks are going to face non-performing assets, not just specific to India. Several sectors of the economy, especially in services, have shut down for 6 to 12 months by the time we completely come out of COVID. As Mr. Prabhu was just explaining, think of airlines, theaters, restaurants. Even if they are opened at 25 to 30% capacity, they are not going to be profitable. Their debts are going to have to get restructured. The banks, therefore, will bear the losses. RBI's financial stability report is already projecting 12.5 to 14.7% gross non-performing assets loans on the balance sheet of the banks. The key part that is missing in any discussion of restructuring, moratoria, etc. in India is, are we recapitalizing the banks for these losses? See, restructuring is a relief to the real sector of the economy. Where is the loss from that going to come from? It's going to manifest on the balance sheets of banks. Do banks have the capital to bear these losses? Large private banks have gone to the market and raised capital there on their own. Why are they able to do it? Because their price to book ratios are actually high. So it's a good time for them to raise money, especially because foreign money is chasing India, given the globally low interest rates. Um, uh, what about smaller private banks? What about public sector banks? more than 50% of our deposits and more than 80% of the losses are with public sector banks. Are they going to be recapitalized for these losses? Because if you don't recapitalize them for the losses, then when the economy is coming out of COVID and healthier parts of the economy require credit, the banking sector will not be interested in providing them credit. It is going to be focused more on dealing with the legacy loans problem because they don't have the capital to deal with the losses. What will happen once again, whatever liquidity the central bank is injecting to them, they will use it to roll over the bad loans in one way or the other because they will not want to recognize further losses. So to me, the key point in all of this is that when we give debt restructuring relief, when we give a moratorium to the real sector of the economy, to the households, to the small businesses, to the corporations, that is a loss on the balance sheet of the bank, and that whatever strategy or program or package you are designing has to also have a plan for recapitalizing the banks, because that has to determine how much moratorium can be afforded, how much debt relief can be afforded. And whatever you want to do, simultaneously you have to fix the banking sector so that it focuses on making healthy loans, because it's only if they have the skin in the game will they not focus on zombie lending. Otherwise, we are going to see a repeat of the last decade where intermediation costs are very high for the healthy parts of the economy, and the rogue borrowers who have many times engaged in fraud get even bigger loans from banks because banks don't want to call them as defaulters, because then they will make further losses and be put to task by the regulator. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom. We are all certainly thrilled to know about all your experiences and in depth knowledge of finance. We certainly look forward to reading your book and understanding your perspective better. On behalf of the entire team of Finjan, I take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Viral Acharya for sparing his valuable time and gracing our event with his presence. Sir, indeed your words have inspired all the students. We would also like to thank all the participants without whom Rendezvous would not have been such a huge success. With these warm words, we now move towards the end of today's webinar. Until next time, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. All the best. Stay safe. Take care. Bye. Thank you for the opportunity.